There are people whose presence feels like a quiet gravity, supple at first, then unmistakable. You feel pulled toward them not because they ask, but because something in you recognizes something in them. A familiar ache, a missing shape, a promise that never fully forms, and yet some connections remain suspended in the space between two hearts, close enough to feel, but never close enough to hold. You watch the distance stay exactly the same no matter how gently you lean in. This is the quiet tragedy of loving someone you can never quite reach, a love defined not by what happens but by what almost does. Story carried in the pause between your hope and their silence. A longing that teaches its own kind of truth. There are moments in life when someone steps into view and, without warning, your inner world stirs, not in loud cinematic ways, not with fireworks or sudden revelations. It happens quietly, like a soft shift in the room's temperature, a subtle awareness that something has arrived. You notice them before you understand why. Their presence moves through you like a breeze brushing past a wind chime, awakening something long still. They speak, or smile, or simply exist near you, and something inside leans forward, not out of desire, not yet, but out of recognition. As if a part of you has been listening for a frequency you didn't know you were missing, and now, suddenly, it's here. Their existence vibrates at a pitch your heart understands, and the connection begins before your logic catches up. This is how most unreachable loves begin, not with intention, but with sensation, a wish without a shape. You don't know it's unreachable yet, you just feel the gravity in the early stages. Everything feels possible, they seem open, present, full of potential. Their laugh feels effortless, their eyes hold warmth or mystery, or pain, and each detail becomes a small door your mind wants to open. You sense depth, you sense history, you sense something rare, even if you can't name it. And so you draw near, you let conversations stretch longer, you pick up on subtleties most people overlook, new way their voice softens when they're tired, the shadow behind a smile, the quick shift of their gaze when vulnerability comes too close. These small details become threads, and, without meaning to, you begin weaving them into meaning. Not fantasy, just connection. But slowly, gently, the other side of the story begins to reveal itself. A hesitation in their honesty, a pause before they answer. A distance that wasn't obvious at first. They're present, but not fully. It's the kind of distance that hides behind charm, politeness, or emotional stillness. A distance that doesn't push you away, but also never truly lets you in. At first you interpret it as mystery, then as shyness, then as the careful boundaries of someone with a complex inner world. But eventually the truth becomes clearer. Something in them doesn't cross certain lines. Something in them stays locked behind a quiet wall. You begin sensing the asymmetry long before you admit it. You lean in a little more. They remain exactly where they are. You open slightly. They stay closed, just enough to notice. Yet nothing in their behavior feels cruel or dismissive. That's the part that confuses the heart. They are kind. They are tender in small ways. They look at you like they see something true. They listen like your words matter. They share moments that feel significant or almost intimate. Almost, the entire connection lives inside that word. Almost. It is the nearly-ness of it that becomes the emotional hook. You feel the potential as something alive. You sense the closeness as something growing. But each time you reach out, your hand touches air. Each time you step forward, they shift back. Not dramatically, but invisibly. Not with rejection, but with subtle retreat. This is the first real recognition, the understanding that your heart is moving, and theirs is not, at least not toward the same place. And still you stay, because the longing began before the logic, because the emotional pull wrote its own story before your rational mind had time to intervene. Because something in their distance feels familiar, not safe, but known. The unreachable are rarely cold. They're often warm enough to keep your hope alive, and reserved enough to keep your heart uncertain. They give just enough to stay unforgettable, and hold back enough to remain untouchable. And so, the tragedy begins quietly. Not with heartbreak, but with recognition. Recognition of a connection that awakens you. Recognition of a person you feel drawn to. Recognition of the distance you can't yet accept. A love that begins in intuition often ends in truth. But the heart rarely understands the ending in the beginning. It only knows the pull. It only knows the hope. It only knows that something inside has already chosen the meme. If they will never choose you, distance rarely begins in the moment you meet someone. It begins long before, shaped in the quiet rooms of childhood, in the shadows of earlier heartbreaks, in the emotional landscapes people learn to survive. By the time you encounter them, The distance is already woven into their way of living, like a language they learned without ever choosing to. Some people carry closeness the way others carry fear. Some hold affection with steady hands, while others flinch without meaning to. And the unreachable often fall into the second category, not because they don't desire love, but because they were taught that receiving it is dangerous or costly or unstable. Their walls are not a choice, they are a memory. What you feel as hesitation is often their history speaking. Perhaps they grew up in a home where emotions were unpredictable, where affection came with conditions, or silence lasted longer than comfort allowed. Maybe they learned to self-soothe because no one else did. Maybe they learned that vulnerability was something that had to be earned, or hidden, or reduced to the smallest possible size. Or perhaps they once opened themselves to love, that left a mark so deep it redefined what safety meant. Betrayal, abandonment, disappointment, emotional loss, these aren't just events. They become blueprints, and some hearts follow those blueprints long after the danger is gone. To you, their distance feels personal. They may not even realize they're doing it. Emotional unreachability rarely announces itself. It lives in subtle behavior, pulling back when connection gets too close, offering warmth, but not depth, sharing pieces while hiding the whole. They're not rejecting love, they're managing fear. The fear of being known too deeply, the fear of repeating a story they never healed from. And then there is your side of the story, the part where your longing isn't accidental either. Your pull toward them didn't appear out of nowhere. It was also shaped somewhere long before this connection existed. Maybe you grew up learning to earn affection. Maybe love for you was something chased rather than offered. Maybe inconsistency feels strangely familiar, something that awakens an old instinct inside you. Humans don't always seek what's good for them. Often they seek what they understand, and sometimes the unreachable feel familiar not because they're right, but because their distance mirrors an old emotional grammar you learned long ago. This isn't weakness, it's recognition. A deep unconscious recognition of a dynamic your heart remembers. Two histories meeting each other. One afraid to be held, one afraid to be abandoned. There is no malice in this pairing, only pattern. The unreachable person might even sense your openness and feel honored by it. They may admire your depth, your clarity, your willingness to feel, and yet, instead of stepping closer, admiration becomes another reason to retreat. They fear disappointing someone who sees them so fully. They fear being asked for something they don't know how to give. Their distance is not a lack of care, it's a lack of emotional language. They speak in guarded silences while you speak in quiet longing. Two dialects of the same desire, connection, translated differently. And though you may keep reaching, hoping your warmth will melt something in them, hoping your sincerity will open a door, the roots of their distance are deeper than your presence, deeper than your kindness, deeper than the current moment. You cannot undo a lifetime of emotional protection simply by offering your heart. That's not how healing works. That's not how fear releases its grip. But the heart rarely knows this in the beginning. It sees possibility, not history. It sees closeness, not the weight behind the hesitation. With time, you start sensing the invisible past, shaping their present. You see how they flinch at vulnerability, even when they smile. You see how they retreat when conversations deepen. You see how they hold themselves apart, not to punish you, but to preserve themselves. And you begin to understand. The distance didn't begin with you, but it will shape what you become to each other. Not lovers, not partners. It's not anything defined. Just two people meeting at the edge of someone's unspoken wounds. One reaching and one stepping back, for reasons neither can fully articulate. That is where the tragedy begins. Not in the love itself, but in the origins of the walls that make it impossible. There is a particular kind of longing that forms when affection flows unevenly. Not absent, just uneven. It doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like uncertainty. And the human mind, longing for patterns and meaning, begins to search for answers in that uncertainty. This is where psychology quietly steps in. Not as explanation, but as mirror. Asymmetrical. Love often begins with intermittent reinforcement. Now a behavioral pattern known for creating some of the strongest emotional bonds. When someone offers warmth one moment and distance the next, the brain learns to chase the moments of closeness, believing they hold the key to unlocking consistency. The unpredictability becomes a kind of emotional hook, not because the person is manipulative, but because the mind is wired to seek completion of broken rhythms. Inconsistent affection doesn't weaken desire, it intensifies it. It's the same mechanism found in addictive behaviors. The reward doesn't need to be constant, it only needs to be possible. And with the unreachable, the possibility is always present, just never steady. You feel it in their eyes, in their small acts of care, in fleeting moments when they soften and something inside them feels reachable. The brain takes those tiny rewards and builds entire narratives around them. The psychology is simple. Attachment systems activate quietly during these dynamics. If you lean toward anxious attachment, uncertainty feels like gravity. Your mind becomes attuned to every shift in tone, every delayed reply, every moment of emotional availability. You begin scanning the connection for signs of closeness, signs of danger, signs of hope. Your tenderness becomes intensity. Your clarity becomes expectation. Your emotional presence becomes something their nervous system interprets as threat, not because you are dangerous, but because intimacy was never safe in their past. These two systems create acting, one hoping, one fearing, one interpreting silence as loss, the other interpreting closeness as risk, both shaped by the stories they carry. Neurobiology plays a role too. Dopamine spikes with anticipation, not fulfillment. Oxytocin releases not only from touch, but from emotional vulnerability. Cortisol rises with uncertainty, binding memory to emotion, because of who they are, but because of what they awaken in your brain. You're not imagining the pull, you're experiencing a neurological response, amplified by emotional inconsistency. But deeper still is the psychological longing to be chosen by someone who is hard to reach. There is something inside many people, their child, a memory, a need, that believes being chosen by the emotion is distant. The tragedy is that this longing doesn't come from the present, it comes from the past. From an earlier version of you who waited for someone who didn't have the capacity to offer what you needed. And now, without realizing it, the heart tries to rewrite that history through a new person who carries similar emotional limitation. It's not out of weakness, out of hope. A deep human hope to finally feel chosen by someone who resembles the ones who didn't choose you before. Asymmetrical love is not a flaw in either person. It's a collision of patterns, a meeting of nervous systems shaped by different forms of fear. One fears loss, one fears engulfment. Both feel pulled toward what they don't fully understand. This is why the unreachable feels so powerful, not because they are inherently special, but because they awaken unresolved emotional mathematics inside the one who reaches for them. They activate the desire to fix what was never your fault. They illuminate wounds you forgot you had. And in this space, this psychological tension between longing and distance, love becomes less about connection and more about pursuit. Not a conscious chase, but a quiet one inside the heart and mind. The science doesn't diminish the beauty of it. It simply reveals that the intensity was never irrational. It was human. It was history echoing through the present. Maybe it was the nervous system trying to make sense of love that never had a clear place to land. This is the psychology of loving someone you can never reach, a blend of brain chemistry, attachment wounds, and the ancient human desire to turn uncertainty into belonging. There comes a point when the truth is no longer distant. It lives close, breathing against the edges of your awareness, on some level, that the connection is uneven. The distance is not temporary. You're reaching for someone who will not, perhaps cannot, meet you in the middle. And yet, something in you hesitates to accept this truth. This is the quiet war inside. It doesn't erupt, it unfolds, slowly, silently, like two opposing tides moving through the same body. One part of you is clear-eyed, steady, rational. It sees the pattern, it counts the inconsistencies. It recognizes how the connection lives mostly in your emotional effort. This part tries to guide you gently away, placing soft hands on your shoulders, urging you to remember your worth, your needs, your reality. But another part, the older part, the vulnerable part, clings to a softer narrative. It remembers how they looked at you that one night with a tenderness that felt real. It remembers the rare moments when their voice cracked, or their guard slit, or their presence softened enough that you glimpsed something genuine beneath. That part whispers, maybe they just need time. Maybe their past is healing. Maybe your presence means more than they can express. Maybe the distance is temporary. Maybe the next conversation will open something that's been closed. Maybe becomes a kind of emotional oxygen. Not because it's true, but because it keeps hope alive. And hope, even fragile, is powerful. The inner war is not between fantasy and reality. It is between two truths, the truth of your longing. You are not naive, you are not delusional, you are simply human. Caught between what your heart feels and what your mind understands. You replay moments, you search for signs, you imagine versions of them they have not yet become. You hold on to potential, Even when the present tells a different story, the conflict is not loud, it's subtle. It shows up in the way your chest tightens after a conversation that felt unfinished, in the way silence hits harder than it should, in the way you check your phone and then feel disappointed at your own expectation, in the way you defend them to yourself, making excuses for the distance. There is guilt too, guilt for wanting more. It's guilt for feeling too deeply, guilt for expecting something they never promised. You tell yourself you're asking for too much, even when what you want is simple. Presence, reciprocity, emotional honesty, the fundamentals of connection. But the quiet war convinces you these things are luxuries, not rights. And then there's the subtle resentment that forms. Not harsh, not angry, just a soft ache beneath the surface. A part of you feels hurt by their distance. A part of you feels protective of them, afraid to push too hard. A part of you feels tired from carrying the emotional weight alone. A part of you feels unable to let go. These feelings coexist without resolution. You care for them deeply, and that care becomes both comfort and burden. You want to be seen, but you also fear what seeing you might demand from them. You want closeness, but you fear pressuring someone who cannot give it. You want honesty, but you fear the honesty might confirm what you hope isn't true. The war is not about staying or leaving. It's about the slow erosion of certainty. The way love becomes a negotiation between desire and reality. The way your emotional system tries to make peace with something fundamentally unbalanced. May it. Through all the conflict, you remain gentle. You do not rage. You do not demand. You simply feel. Deeply, this is the quiet war. The place between knowing and wanting. Between accepting who they are and longing for who they could be. Between the love you experience and the love you imagine. Between the hope that keeps you close and the truth that keeps you hurting. Every unreachable love contains this inner battle, not because the connection is weak, but because your heart is strong enough to hold contradictions, even when they pull you in opposite directions. There is a moment, quiet, nearly invisible, when something in you begins to shift, not because of a dramatic event, not because of a final disappointment or a sudden awakening. The change emerges the way dawn does, gradually, softly, almost imperceptibly, until you suddenly realize the light has transformed the room. The turning point in loving someone you can never reach is not a collapse. It's a recognition, a gentle clarity that arrives without force. It begins with a small observation. You notice how often the conversations feel unbalanced. You notice the familiar ache returning after each moment of closeness. You notice that you are always the one reaching out first, wondering silently whether they even feel the shift in distance as deeply as you do. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no argument, no confession, no sudden withdrawal, just a slow understanding that your emotional steps forward are not being met with steps of equal weight. You begin to see them not as a possibility, but as a person, a whole person with fears, limitations, habits, and emotional blind spots. The pedestal quietly dissolves, not out of disappointment, but out of clarity. This clarity feels different from heartbreak. It is softer, more patient. It doesn't ask you to stop caring. It simply reminds you to see reality gently, without the haze of hope that once blurred the edges. The turning point often forms in the small moments when their distance feels heavier than usual, when they respond with kindness but not depth, when you realize you've been interpreting their gestures as meaning more than they intended, when you catch yourself waiting for something they never promised to give, and then, almost unexpectedly, a new thought appears. Maybe this connection was never meant to become what I hoped. Not in a bitter way, not in a defeated way, just this realization settles into your body differently than longing does. Longing vibrates, clarity quiets. There is a stillness that comes with acceptance. Even if the acceptance is unfinished, you start to understand that loving them is not the same as reaching them. The two are not intertwined. You can care without it transforming into closeness. You can see someone's inner world with tenderness, even if they never open the door. The turning point is not the end of the connection. It is the end of an illusion. You no longer imagine that your love will heal their wounds. You no longer interpret their silence as mystery. You no longer wait for a moment that changes everything. You begin to see that they are already telling you who they are, not through their words, but through their limitations. And instead of trying to change that truth, you begin to soften around it. You begin to let the distance be what it is. Not a verdict, not a rejection, just a boundary shaped by two histories that do not fit as neatly as the heart once hoped. There is tenderness in this realization. You do not blame them. You do not blame yourself. You simply see things more clearly. Acceptance doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves. One moment you feel ready to let go. The next, the familiar ache returns. But each wave brings you a little closer to equilibrium, a little closer to understanding that not all love is meant to become relationship, and not all connections are meant to be held. And strangely, this turning point brings a sense of relief, not because the longing disappears, but because the confusion begins to fade. The war inside quiets. Hope becomes grounded instead of restless. Love becomes gentler instead of urgent. The realization arrives softly. You can care deeply for someone and still step back. You can honor what you felt without needing it to become more. You can love someone you cannot reach and still move toward yourself. This turning point is not closure. It is the beginning of understanding. A small, fragile doorway into peace, healing from an unreachable love, is not a sudden release. It is not a moment where the heart snaps shut or the longing evaporates. Healing in this kind of story feels more like learning to breathe in a different rhythm, slowly, gently, without forcing yourself to forget. Because the truth is simple. You do not stop caring, you stop clinging. Avoidant begins quietly, in the spaces where you finally allow yourself to feel everything without trying to change it. The ache is still there, but it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a memory, a reminder of what your heart is capable of, a soft echo instead of a sharp pain. For the first time, you begin to see the connection not as something unfinished, but as something complete in its own shape. It didn't fail. It didn't fall apart. It simply existed within the limits it was destined to have. And in accepting those limits, you reclaim the parts of yourself you gave away in hope. You start noticing the subtle shift inside you. You check your phone less often. You no longer rehearse what you might say next time you see them. You stop interpreting silence as a message. You stop waiting for a possibility that once felt inevitable. Instead, you begin turning inward, gently, without judgment, toward the needs you suppressed while reaching for someone who couldn't meet you halfway. You notice the places where your loneliness stretched itself to accommodate another person's walls. You notice how often you dimmed your own desires to avoid overwhelming them. You notice how much of your tenderness you carried quietly, hoping it would be understood without needing to be asked for. Avoidant is the moment you understand that loving someone and being able to build a life with them are not the same thing. One depends on your heart. The other depends on two hearts moving toward each other with the same intention. And intention is something you cannot create alone. There is no resentment here, no anger. Only understanding. You see them with clearer eyes, not smaller, not diminished, just real. You recognize their limitations as part of their story, not a reflection of your worth. You recognize your longing as part of your humanity, not a sign of weakness. You recognize that the love you felt was not wasted simply because it could not land. Love is never wasted, even when it stays unspoken, even when it lives at a distance, even when it remains one-sided, because love is an internal experience first. Something that shapes you, opens you, teaches you. An unreachable love teaches a specific kind of wisdom. How to feel deeply without losing yourself inside the feeling. Avoidant means you hold the memory softly, like a book you once cherished, but no longer need to carry everywhere. The story remains meaningful, but its weight becomes lighter. Sometimes you still think of them. Sometimes you still feel a small ache when something reminds you of what almost happened. But the ache has changed. It's no longer a longing for what could be. It's gratitude for what was revealed inside you. It's the realization that you can care for someone without trying to reach them anymore. And this is its own kind of freedom, the freedom to let a person emotional world, the freedom to love without expectation, the freedom to walk forward without erasing the past, the freedom to hold tenderness without holding on to them. In time, you begin to understand that the connection gave you something valuable, a clearer understanding of what your heart needs to feel steady, safe, and seen. You learn what reciprocity feels like by noticing its absence. You learn your emotional depth by recognizing where it had no place to land. You learn the quiet art of choosing yourself, not angrily but compassionately. Avoidant is not forgetting, it is honoring what the connection awakened in you, honoring the truth of their limitation, honoring your capacity to love, even when it leads you into difficult terrain. And slowly, with time and reflection, you step into a new emotional chapter. One where your heart remains open, but your boundaries are clearer. One where longing no longer rules you. One where distance no longer feels like destiny. This is how unreachable love settles into the soul, not as a wound, not as a regret, but as a soft, completed lesson that shaped you gently toward yourself. In the end, every unreachable love leaves behind an echo, not a loud one, not something that demands attention or reshapes your world overnight. The echo is subtle, now quiet resonance that lingers in the spaces between who you were before them and who you have become after. It appears in fleeting moments like a soft shadow cast across memory, a familiar ache when a song plays, a brief warmth when you think of a conversation that once meant more than you admitted, a tiny pause when their name crosses your mind, No longer sharp, no longer heavy, just there like a gentle note that hasn't fully faded. The closure in this kind of love is not about ending. It's about reinterpreting. You begin to see the connection as a chapter rather than a destination, a meaningful crossing of paths, even if the paths were never meant to merge. There is no bitterness now, no longing for what could have been, no quiet arguments with yourself about why things unfolded the way they did. The longing has transformed. Oh, from desire to ache, to understanding, to something softer than all three. You can revisit the memory without falling into it. You can think of them without hoping they will return in a different form. You can remember the closeness without reopening the pain of the distance. This is what closure looks like in the most human sense. Not forgetting, not forcing an ending, but allowing the story to take its natural shape. There was someone you cared for deeply, someone who awakened old emotions and new insights, someone who taught you, without meaning to, what your heart still hopes for, and what it can no longer settle for. The echo stays, but it no longer pulls you backward. It simply accompanies you, like a reminder of your emotional capacity. A quiet testament to the depth with which you are able to feel. You realize eventually that this love was not a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was a moment of your life where your heart opened wider than it ever had before. A landscape of tenderness that expanded your understanding of connection, longing and self-awareness. Yes, it was painful at times. Yes, the distance was real. Yes, something inside you reached for something that could not reach back. But there is a strange kind of beauty in loving someone without needing to possess them. A purity in caring for someone whose path was never meant to intertwine fully with yours. A quiet nobility in feeling deeply without demanding a resolution. Some connections are not meant to become stories you live. They become stories you carry. You begin to accept that their role in your life was not to stay, but to reveal, to reflect something back to you. Your tenderness, your patterns, your vulnerabilities, your longing, your resilience, your capacity to love without guarantees. And as you integrate all of these pieces, a wider clarity emerges. The people you cannot reach still shape you, not through their absence, but through what they awaken. The echo becomes a compass, not a chain. It helps you recognize when your heart begins slipping into old dynamics. It helps you sense when you're giving too much without receiving enough. It helps you choose connections where emotional reciprocity feels natural rather than earned. Karma in this sense is not finality. It is continuity, a smooth transition from emotional intensity to emotional wisdom. And when you finally look back, really look back, you don't see a love that failed. You see a love that simply existed in the form it was meant to. Incomplete perhaps, but still meaningful, still human, still real in its own quiet way. The unreachable remain part of your story, even if only as a soft echo, a reminder that love does not always need to be held to be pure. A reminder that some people touch your life not by staying, but by passing through in a way that reveals something essential about your heart. Their presence may fade, but the opening they created stays. And that opening becomes the place where the next chapter of your emotional life begins. Clearer, steadier, softer, and infinitely more your own.